The fitness industry has long promoted this idea of a neutral spine, but I actually disagree quite a bit with some of the commonly accepted premises of what a neutral spine is and what it's good for and what we can do to actually get into a proper one. The normal, natural resting position of the spine should have some degree of lumbar lordosis or extension, some degree of thoracic kyphosis or what we call flexion, and then some degree of cervical lordosis and extension. So why does it make sense for us to have some rigid flat back right here? This is just promoting a lot of thoracic extension, more lumbar extension in most cases, and also extension of the cervical spine right here. This is not setting us up for an ideal posture, whether we are just standing or whether we're lifting weights with load. So why does it make sense then to have this rigid flat back position right here where we are promoting more thoracic extension, more usually lumbar extension than usual, and also taking away the natural curvature of the neck? This is not setting us up for success, and there's actually some research to support this. There was a comparison done between people lifting with what we would consider a neutral, good position of the spine, like I just showed with that flat back posture, versus more of a flexed position. And there was actually no meaningful difference between those two groups in terms of injury rates. And actually, in some instances, the extended position, more of the good position, as many people would refer to it as, actually had a higher injury rate than the other postures, which is quite interesting. What this goes to show is that our idea of what a neutral spine is might not be fully accurate. And also, just because we can get into what we consider a neutral spine doesn't mean that it's going to protect us from injury or reduce our pain in any meaningful way. However, if we do want to promote a genuine neutral position of the spine, we need to understand how we can get into a position where we have a little bit of lumbar lordosis and a little bit of thoracic kyphosis and then the cervical lordosis, but not at the cost of losing the ability to stack the head over the rib cage, over the pelvis. It's important to understand that this neutral starting point of the spine is exactly that. It's a starting point. It's not an end destination. This neutral position of the spine allows us freedom of movement. It gives us the most opportunity to move into other positions because that's ultimately the goal, right? As humans, we're dynamic creatures that need to be able to rotate, extend, and flex. But if we're already starting from a position of extension, it's hard to move into more extension, and you're going to find that extension somewhere you probably don't want to. If we're already too flexed, it's hard for us to then move into more flexion or maximal flexion from that starting position, and so on and so forth. So it's important to understand that, hey, we're going to get into this position, but you're going to move out of it. But it's important to be able to, in the first place, access it. For example, many people are already starting in this position where they have this flat back because they think that's great and ideal for movement and also to reduce injuries. Well, actually, the way most people do it, they're putting a lot of stress on their low back by extending like that. So as they go and they lift weights, let's say they're doing deadlifts or squats, they're actually limiting their ability to move into a genuine neutral position because they're so extended. They're just pushing more and more force onto those lumbar vertebrae. And I think that is what's ultimately causing a lot of those injuries, as we saw in that study that compared those different postures. I actually think that this position promotes more stress on the low back than just getting a little bit more flexion in the system. So I'm going to show you how I coach what we commonly refer to as the stack, which is a stacked position of the head, the thorax, the rib cage, and the pelvis. If we can get into that position, things tend to look and feel really good. Now, I'm also going to show you how you can apply that to different exercises as well for basic examples. This is a tutorial on how we teach stacking mechanics. This is one of the first things that I will teach any client, regardless of what their goal is, because this is going to put them in a really good position to align the head, the rib cage, the pelvis, and the rest of the body. Usually when these structures are in place, everything else clicks into the right place as a result of these bigger proximal structures being aligned. So what I usually say is, Trevor, I just want you to stand with your feet relatively hip width apart, and I want you to feel the foot contacts of your heel, particularly your inner heel, your first metatarsal head, and not losing the outside foot. So also feel a little bit of your fifth metatarsal head right there. And that's just gonna give us a stable base of support. Now, you're gonna bend your knees very, very slightly, just maybe 5–10% max. And now I want you to put your hands on your hips. And imagine your pelvis is a bowl of water. You don't want it to spill out the front too much. You don't want it to spill out the back. You want it to be nice and neutral. So depending on whether someone has in their resting posture a anterior or posterior tilt of the pelvis, you may need to adjust. Most people will have more of an anterior tilt, so you might want to cue them to bring their pelvis a little bit under them. On that same note of getting that posterior tilt, as we'll talk about in a second, you want the posterior tilt coming from the position of the rib cage being in the right position. So I don't want any tension in the glutes or really even like the six-pack abs as they tuck. I want it to happen because of a natural exhale. So exhaling will naturally bring the rib cage down, and you'll see how that works in a second. The next thing we're going to do is get the rib cage in a good position. So we know that the normal human spine curve has that S-shaped curve. So we have a little bit of lumbar lordosis and extension, a little bit of thoracic kyphosis and flexion, and our head has a little bit of lordosis as well. So we're going to go after a little bit of the kyphosis here. So I'm going to have Trevor keeping his eyes at straight ahead, horizon level. He's going to reach his arms out in front of him, very slightly protracting the shoulder. He's getting a little bit of space between his scapula and his spine. He doesn't want to reach so much that his sternum depresses. He just wants to stay tall and get that nice reach. Now, if I notice that Trevor now becomes a little bit too extended through his low back as he does this, I'm going to cue him to exhale and bring his rib cage down underneath him. Now, you can tell that Trevor looks pretty good in this position right here. His head is stacked over his ribs, which are stacked over his hips and his feet. This is what I will say is the stack. I'll tell my clients, I want you to sear this into your brain, and I want you to really memorize what this feels like, because these same principles apply to so many different exercises like we're about to show you. Now let me show you how we can apply this to something simple like a goblet squat, because we're not always going to be able to just reach like this. But if I have Trevor hold that in a normal kettlebell goblet position like this, I can still have him get all of the same things we just talked about. So foot pressures are there, very slight unlocking of the knees, eyes at horizon level. Now here is how we get the rib cage and pelvis stacked. Take the weight, still hold it close, but reach the elbows a little bit further away from you, just a tiny bit. And you'll see that his sternum stays up and his ribs come back a little bit, and that exhale sets the rib cage in a good position. Now, Trevor can inhale and descend by unlocking at the knees and going down, and he can exhale coming back up, maintaining that slight reach of the elbows. What we don't want to do is we don't want to have a position where he's reaching the weight away from him as he pushes back. That's going to throw off his center of mass a lot. So he wants to make sure that the weight's staying close. It's just that elbow reach that's going to give him that protraction. Now, when we do it in a hinge, it's a little bit easier because we can get that full reach. So everything would apply as normal. So slight unlocking of the knees, pelvis is neutral, reach those arms and get that full exhale. Now, the tricky part with this though is maintaining this together as he goes into the hinge. So he's gonna make sure he gets that forward folding and pushing his hips back. You can tell that he still has maintained that relationship really nicely. So this is mostly flat, little bit of rounding here, but eyes are at 6 feet in front of him, and then he can come up, press through those foot contacts, and make sure he ends in that hip extended position. Now there's obviously 1,000 different row variations, but we're gonna choose this chest supported row because it helps illustrate pretty clearly visually what we want in the stack here. So Trevor would allow his head to be hanging off of the bench a little bit, but supported by the pad, so that way he can maintain a little bit of that natural lordosis of the neck, and his low back will naturally be in that position where it has a little bit of the lordosis simply because of that prone position. And all he's gonna do is very gently reach the weights away from him. Not so much to where his sternum depresses and his back rounds like that, just a tiny bit of a reach, just maybe like 10–15%. Now all he's gonna do is maintain that as he pulls his elbow in. Usually when we row, we wanna lead with the elbow, not the scap, because that's gonna have us lose that congruency of the scapula on that rib cage. So he's gonna lead with the elbow, and the scapula will take care of itself in most cases. If we're doing a press and we want to maintain that stack to the maximal extent that is possible, like let's say we're teaching someone how to press effectively, a hook lying position could be really helpful, or just putting the feet on those pegs down below could also be a good way to still make sure that low back can be flat on the bench. If you don't have those pegs, you can put a couple of 45-pound plates on the floor and stack them up so that way you can still get that flat back against the bench there. Now, when it comes to a press, it's very common to hear squeeze your shoulders back and puff your chest out. That is not going to get you the stack. That's going to reduce that curvature in the thoracic spine. That's going to create a lot of compression there. That's actually problematic for the shoulder. So what we want is to feel the space in between our scapula and the spine right in here on the bench, but not trying to force ourselves into that position. We just want to gently feel that pressure up against the bench without our shoulders rounding forward. Now, as Trevor goes to the press, he's going to lower one weight, and naturally that will have the scapula come back closer to the spine. That's natural, allow that to happen. And then pressing up, allowing his scapula to very slightly move away from the spine, but not to the point where his shoulder rounds forward. You can make sure you're doing that well if your sternum stays up. If your sternum stays up at the ceiling, then you're doing it in all likelihood really well. But if your sternum depresses, then that's not good. Now, if you're a power lifter or you're someone using really heavy or maximal loads, we want your diaphragm to act more as a muscle of stabilization rather than its role in respiration. That will allow you to create more stiffness and lift more weight. So the way that you can do that is just pretty much the same thing, but there's a slight difference. So we'll exhale until we feel those side abs engage. And then we're going to take a strong inhale on top of that, maintaining our rib cage position with those side abs. And then we're going to go straight down, holding that. And then you want to make sure that your tongue is against the roof of your mouth as you do that, as you hold that brace. And then you can reset that brace in between reps. So then at the top, you would exhale again, inhale on top of it, go straight down. There we go. For a deadlift, it's a very similar process, but you have two options available to you. We can add a reach at the beginning, which will allow you to get your ribs stacked over your pelvis. So you want to very slightly push your ribs back as you protract your shoulders without losing any height in your skeleton. Again, that's the most important part. So you don't want to do that. You want to just slightly push your ribs back, keeping your pelvis as that neutral bowl of water. And now exhale, find those side abs. Boom. Inhale as you start to hinge down and grab that bar. Now, if you're not using super heavy loads, you can exhale again as you come back up. Inhale on the way down. But if you are using super heavy maximal loads, you can hold that inhale, put your tongue against the roof of your mouth, and then hold that brace that way. And just as the other option, some people don't like to reach, so you could just do the breathing strategy there at the top, and you can kind of get your arms down as you finish off that inhale and go down and grab the bar. Just as a little side note, stay tuned in for a weight training program I'm going to be releasing in 2024. I'm putting it together right now, and it's going to be a great program for those of you looking to make some gains in the weight room and build a little muscle, get a little stronger, but also improve your mobility while doing it. And I'm going to be using myself as a case study to show how one can build muscle and gain mobility at the same time, and then I'm going to release it. So there it is. Go try to apply this to your exercises in the weight room, but also just within your regular posture if you want to feel a little bit more stacked. All you really got to do is sit or stand tall and then just get a nice exhale, making sure your pressures are evenly distributed through your feet, and it's really not too hard beyond that. Just those little subtle adjustments can make a big difference in how you feel and move.